Mr. Bowen, good morning, sir. You're charged with one count first-degree premeditated murder. You're also charged with one count tampering with or fabricating physical evidence.
No. He did something to her. Those 5 words were spoken on an ordinary Wednesday morning in Coral Springs, Florida. Not by a detective, not by a witness standing outside crime scene, but by a man who walked into his uncle's home, sat down, and said them himself. By the time anyone outside that room understood what those words meant, Vice Mayor Nancy Metayer Bowen had already been dead for hours. This is Fatal Vows. On the morning of April 1st, 2026, the city of Coral Springs was moving through what appeared to be a routine Wednesday. Meetings were scheduled. Staff were at their desks. Elected officials were expected in their seats. And one of those officials, the vice mayor of the city, a woman who had spent years building one of the most significant careers in South Florida's political landscape, did not show up. At first, it registered as unusual, then concerning, then something that could not be explained away. She had missed a morning meeting, then a second. Her phone was not being answered. Her colleagues had no explanation. And the man who should have known where his wife was, her husband, Stephen Bowen, responded to a text from city staff with a message that, on its surface, seemed cooperative. She was not picking up, he said. Her car was not at the house. What Stephen Bowen knew, and what no one else on that Wednesday morning yet understood, was that Nancy was not going to answer her phone. She was not coming to any meeting. And her car being absent from the driveway had nothing to do with where she had gone. She was inside that house. She had been there all night. When Coral Springs police officers arrived at the couple's home on the 800 block of Northwest 127th Avenue at 10:04 that morning for a welfare check, they noticed something on the exterior of the building before they even reached the front door. There was visible damage to the outside of the structure, damage that told investigators something serious had happened inside. No spare key was available. No one responded. A SWAT team was called to force entry. What they found inside the second-floor master bedroom ended any remaining possibility that this was a misunderstanding. Nancy Metayer Bowen, vice mayor, environmental scientist, and one of the most promising political figures in the state of Florida, was gone. She was 38 years old, and her husband was nowhere on the property. Across Broward County at that same moment, Stephen Bowen had already made his next move. He had driven south from Coral Springs. He had gone to his uncle's home. He had said what he said, and then he kept moving, putting distance between himself and everything that was about to come. What makes this case so difficult to process is not just what happened. It is everything that surrounded it. Nancy Metayer Bowen was not a woman whose life showed any visible signs of what was unfolding behind closed doors. To the public, to her colleagues, to the people who worked alongside her every single day, she was a woman on the rise. A woman at the height of her career. A woman who, days before her death, had been preparing to make the most significant announcement of her political life. She never got to make it. Within hours of the discovery, 3 separate law enforcement agencies were coordinating across county lines. License plate readers were actively tracking Stephen Bowen's vehicle as it moved through city after city. In a case that would send shockwaves through the state of Florida, a case about a woman who was days away from announcing a run for the United States Congress, was beginning to crack open in ways that no one in Coral Springs could have anticipated that morning. The city had lost its vice mayor. A family had lost a daughter, a sister, and a friend. And a community that had watched Nancy Metayer Bowen break barriers, open doors, and build something real over the course of years was now left trying to understand how a woman so publicly present could have been carrying something so private, and how a Tuesday night that seemed like any other could have ended the way it did. There are questions in this case that the full legal process has not yet answered. There are details still working their way through the courts. But what is already on record, what investigators documented, what witnesses said, what surveillance cameras captured, and what Stephen Bowen himself admitted, tells a story that is both factual and deeply unsettling. This is the story of Vice Mayor Nancy Metayer Bowen. What she built across a career defined by purpose and persistence. What was taken from her on the night of March 31st, 2026. And how the truth behind a private door in a quiet Florida neighborhood came to light on the morning of April 1st. Fatal Vows. Stay with us. To understand why the death of Nancy Metayer Bowen hit the way it did, not just in Coral Springs, not just in Florida, but across an entire political community, you have to start with who she actually was before April 1st, 2026 became the date that defined her name in the news. Because the woman at the center of this case was not simply a local official who held a title. She was someone who had been building something real, something documented, and something that the people around her had watched take shape over nearly 2 decades of consistent, deliberate work. Nancy Metayer Bowen was 38 years old, a first-generation Haitian American woman from South Florida. By training, she was an environmental scientist. By choice, she was a public servant. And by record, she was a woman who had walked into rooms where no one who looked like her had ever stood before, and had not just held her ground, but expanded what that ground could hold. She earned a Bachelor of Science from Florida A&M University. She then completed a Master of Health Science from Johns Hopkins-University, one of the most respected institutions in the country for public health and policy research. That academic background was not ornamental. She applied it directly. Before she ever held elected office, Nancy worked on the ground through the Broward Soil and Water Conservation District, leading environmental justice efforts across the state of Florida. Her work was operational and specific, addressing water access crises, responding to infrastructure damage caused by hurricanes Irma, Michael, and Dorian, and advocating for communities that carried the heaviest environmental burdens while holding the least political leverage. She spent time in the office of former U.S. Senator Bill Nelson. She completed an internship under the Obama administration. Each step was intentional. Each position built on the one before it. In 2020, she ran for a seat on the Coral Springs City Commission. She won. And in winning, she made history, becoming the first black woman and the first Haitian American ever elected to that commission. In a city that had existed for decades, without someone like her in that seat, her election was not just a personal achievement. It was a structural change. She understood the weight of that, and she carried it with the seriousness it deserved. For years later, in 2024, she ran for re-election. No opponent came forward to challenge her. She won unopposed. By November 2025, her fellow commissioners appointed her to serve a second consecutive term as vice mayor of Coral Springs. Her influence did not stop at the city line. During the 2024 presidential election cycle, both the Biden campaign and the Harris campaign selected Nancy to serve as Florida's Caribbean Vote Director, placing her at the center of national political strategy and voter mobilization across one of the most contested states in the country. In March 2025, the Florida Democratic Party named her vice chair of Haitian American voter engagement. She was operating at the local level and the national level simultaneously, and doing it with the kind of credibility that takes years to earn. Her trajectory had been shaped, in part, by an organization that most outside coverage of this case has largely overlooked. SANTLA is a South Florida civic leadership development program run by Executive Director Jeffsy Metellus. Years before Nancy held any elected title, SANTLA identified her as a fellow and invested in her growth as a civic leader. She was one of only 4 graduates of that program who ultimately went on to seek elected office. The program recognized her potential before most of the political landscape did. That is not a minor detail. It tells you something about the kind of person Nancy was, someone that serious, experienced people with serious professional judgment looked at and said, this one is going somewhere. By late March 2026, that somewhere had a specific address. Nancy was preparing to announce a run for Florida's 20th congressional district, the federal seat that had been held by Representative Sheila Cherfilus McCormick, who was at that time under federal investigation for ethics violations and alleged criminal conduct. The seat was effectively open. The timing was right. The support was there. U.S. Representative Jared Moskowitz, who had spent time with Nancy just the Saturday before her death, 4 days before she was found, confirmed publicly that she had already secured backing from local leaders, elected officials, family members, and community supporters across the district. The announcement was days away. The groundwork had been laid. Alfredo Olvera, a close friend who had known Nancy for nearly a decade, described what April 1st was supposed to have been. It was supposed to be the day she stepped forward publicly, the day the next chapter of her career became official. He had known about her plans. He had watched her build toward that moment. And then, he said, the day became something none of them had words for. The people who worked beside Nancy over the years described her in ways that were consistent regardless of who was speaking. Her mentee, Crystal Ludor, said that no matter what was on the agenda, every conversation with Nancy eventually came back to the same question. What are we going to do to help the people? Not a talking point, a governing instinct. Sandra Dennis, executive director of the Miami Workers Center and a longtime professional collaborator, put it plainly. Nancy was a community organizer and a legislator who held equity at the center of every decision she made. That is the woman this documentary is about. Not a headline, not a political symbol. A person with a verified record, a clear direction, and a career that was, by every credible and documented measure, still in the process of reaching what it had always been building toward. And even as she was standing at the edge of her most significant professional moment, the people who loved her most were already living inside a grief that almost no one on the outside could see. What most coverage of this case does not tell you, and what makes this story significantly more layered than the headlines suggest, is that Nancy Metayer Bowen was not simply a woman at the height of her career when she was killed. She was a woman who had already been through something that would have broken most people entirely, and she had been carrying it quietly for months. To understand the full picture of what was happening inside that Coral Springs home in the weeks and months before March 31st, 2026, you have to go back to December 15th, 2025. 107 days before Nancy was found dead, her younger brother, Donovan Joshua Lee Metayer, passed away. He was 26 years old. Donovan's story does not begin in December 2025. It begins on February 14th, 2018, a date that anyone who followed American news that year will recognize immediately. Donovan was a senior at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland, Florida, on the day a gunman entered that campus and took the lives of 17 students and staff members. Donovan was there. Donovan walked out alive. But walking out alive did not mean walking away whole. In the months and years that followed, the Metayer family watched Donovan change. The young man they had known, described by his own family as brilliant, naturally curious, and academically driven, someone with plans to study computer science and a warmth that people around him noticed immediately, became increasingly difficult to reach. Depression set in. Isolation followed. The future he had mapped out for himself quietly slipped out of reach as his mental health continued to decline year after year. Over the next 7 years, Donovan was hospitalized multiple times as his condition worsened. His family fought consistently to get him stable, adequate care through a healthcare system they publicly described as fragmented, under-resourced, and slow to respond to the full complexity of what he was living with. He was eventually diagnosed with schizophrenia. That diagnosis alone took years to arrive. Managing it took even longer. The barriers the family faced in trying to access proper, sustained treatment were real, documented, and persistent. They never fully went away. On December 15th, 2025, after a 7-year battle with schizophrenia, Donovan Joshua Lee Metayer passed away. He was 26 years old. Nancy did not retreat from the public weight of that loss. On December 21st, 2025, she posted openly on Facebook. She wrote directly and without deflection, identifying her brother by name and describing the years of mental health struggles that had preceded his passing. She did not minimize it. She did not dress it up. She named it plainly because she believed that silence around mental health, the kind of silence that her own family had lived inside for years, was part of what allowed other families to suffer the same way, without support. In the days that followed, Nancy and her family launched a GoFundMe. The goal was not only to cover the costs of Donovan's services. It was to establish a dedicated mental health fund at Henderson Behavioral Health in Donovan's name, specifically designed to give other families access to resources that the Metayer family had spent years trying to obtain and could not always reach when they needed them most. In her own words, Donovan was the sibling she had always felt the strongest need to protect. That statement, made publicly and without hesitation, speaks to a relationship that carried enormous weight, and to a loss that did not resolve itself when the calendar turned to January 2026, when U.S. Representative Jared Moskowitz spoke publicly in the days following Nancy's death. He did not separate the two losses. He named them together and in sequence. He pointed out that Nancy had just buried her brother, that she had been preparing, even through that grief, to step forward and announce her congressional campaign, that the forward momentum of her career and the private weight of her family's loss had been running alongside each other inside the same life, at the same time, without pause. What the public record shows is this. The house on Northwest 127th Avenue in Coral Springs was not simply a residence in early 2026. It was a place where profound loss had recently arrived, where a family was still in the middle of processing grief that had no clean or simple resolution, where two people, Nancy and her husband, Stephen Bowen, were living inside all of that together. What was happening on Stephen Bowen's side of that marriage, and what the documented record reveals about the man Nancy had been living with, is where this case moves next. On the surface, Stephen Bowen looked like a man who had built a stable, purposeful life. 40 years old at the time of his arrest, a licensed professional, a faith community leader, a husband of 4 years. Nothing in his public profile pointed toward what investigators would come to document about the night of March 31st, 2026. He and Nancy had married in 2022. By all externally visible evidence, their marriage was private and unremarkable in the way most private marriages are. No public disputes on record. No documented incidents. No reports from colleagues, neighbors, or community members indicating that anything was wrong. The people who worked alongside Nancy professionally, people who saw her regularly, who knew her schedule, who communicated with her daily, had no indication that the home life she returned to each evening was anything other than what it appeared to be. Professionally, Stephen Bowen held an active radiology technician license at the time of his arrest. His listed employer was Delray Medical Center, a functioning healthcare facility in South Florida. That role matters in terms of context. Radiology technicians operate in a clinical environment that requires ongoing licensing compliance, technical precision, and a standard of professional conduct that is both monitored and regulated at the state level. Stephen Bowen was not a man without structure or professional accountability. He worked inside a system that required both consistently. Outside of his medical career, Bowen served as chief operating officer of an organization called Men of St. Luke, a Broward County-based faith nonprofit that, according to its own published materials, was built around creating community for men through fellowship and discipleship. In the period leading up to March 2026, the organization had held a Bible study gathering and a community dinner. His role within that organization placed him at the center of a faith community structured around shared values, mutual accountability, and purpose. His Instagram account, operated under the handle at Kingsby85, gave the public a specific and voluntary window into how Stephen Bowen saw himself. The account contained 7 posts featuring him and Nancy together, photographs that included anniversary celebrations and shared moments that documented a marriage that, from the outside, appeared to be functioning and intact. Alongside those posts were multiple photographs and videos taken at shooting ranges. Stephen Bowen was someone who spent time with firearms, who trained with them regularly, and who made no effort to keep that aspect of his life private. His account biography stated his identity in exactly 3 words: God, husband, armed. That was the public-facing version of Stephen Bowen that anyone could find. What the court record begins to reveal is a different layer entirely. In November 2025, the same month Nancy was reappointed as vice mayor of Coral Springs, the couple received a civil lawsuit from their homeowners association. Court documents obtained and reported by TMZ showed that the HOA was pursuing the couple for defaulting on $3,710.25 in unpaid fees. The association was not simply requesting payment. They were seeking court authorization to foreclose on the property in order to collect what they were owed. A foreclosure filing is a significant legal escalation, one that only occurs when a default has reached the point where the creditor sees no other path forward. The suit was voluntarily dismissed in January 2026. But a voluntary dismissal is not the same as a resolved problem. It means the formal legal action was withdrawn. It does not mean the financial pressure that produced the lawsuit in the first place had been addressed or removed. That pressure was still present in the household. It was still real. And 2 months after that dismissal, the events of March 31st, 2026 took place. On the evening of that Tuesday, Stephen Bowen called his mother. He told her he was experiencing a panic attack. He said he intended to speak with Nancy that night. That phone call was the last communication his family had from him before the following morning, when a sequence of events that would bring 3 law enforcement agencies into Broward County began to move. What Bowen later disclosed to his uncle, Owen Small, and what is formally documented in the Coral Springs Police Department probable cause affidavit is that a confrontation took place inside the home that night and that Nancy did not survive it. The affidavit further documents that after the events of that evening, Bowen remained inside the residence through the night before leaving the following morning. When the question of why was put to him, Stephen Bowen offered 3 words in response. He said he could not take it anymore. Those words are part of the official record. They are the only explanation he provided. No elaboration followed. No additional context was offered beyond those 7 syllables. As of the recording of this documentary, no formal legal motive has been established in court proceedings. What those 3 words actually mean, and what the prosecution will argue they reflect about the state of that marriage and the events of that night, is a question that has not yet been answered before a jury. What the verified record does show is a man who held a professional medical license, led a faith-based nonprofit, publicly celebrated his marriage on social media, documented his regular use of firearms, faced specific and documented financial pressure in the months leading up to March 2026, and made a phone call to his mother on the evening of March 31st, saying he was struggling before the night took the turn that it did. That is who Stephen Bowen was on paper and in the public record before this case placed his name in front of the entire country. Before we move into what happened next, how this came alight, who discovered what, and how law enforcement began to piece together the events of that night, this is the moment to make sure you are subscribed to Fatal Vows. This case is still moving through the legal system. The full trial has not yet taken place. When it does, Fatal Vows will be present for every development, every court filing, every hearing, and every detail that enters the public record. Subscribe now and turn on notifications so you do not follow this story from the middle. What you are about to hear is where this case stops being background and starts being an active investigation. By the morning of April 1st, 2026, 3 separate law enforcement agencies were coordinating across Broward County. License plate readers were pulling real-time data on a vehicle moving south through multiple cities. And a man who had already told his uncle what he had done was still out there, still moving, still trying to put distance between himself and what he had left behind. Before we break down exactly how investigators tracked Stephen Bowen across Broward County within hours, and what the forensic evidence revealed when law enforcement finally got inside that home, make sure you're subscribed to Fatal Vows right now. We cover relationship homicide cases from the moment of arrest through the final verdict, with a level of investigative detail that most channels walk away from after the story stops trending. This case is heading to trial, and Fatal Vows will be there for every single development, every filing, every hearing, and every moment that matters. Hit subscribe, turn on notifications, and stay with us. By the morning of April 1st, 2026, the city of Coral Springs had no idea what had happened on Northwest 127th Avenue the night before. But the chain of events that would bring that truth to the surface had already begun, and it started not with a phone call to police, not with a neighbor raising an alarm, but with an empty chair at a meeting that Nancy Metayer Bowen had never missed. Nancy had 2 scheduled meetings that Wednesday morning. The first passed without her. Staff noticed but waited. The second was a 9 a.m. commission session, a meeting that Coral Springs Police Chief Brad Mock was personally scheduled to attend in his official capacity. Nancy was not there. No phone call had come in. No message had been sent to anyone at the city. For a woman her colleagues described consistently as present, reliable, and communicative, that silence was not a minor irregularity. It was a signal. Commission Relationship Manager Lewum Gourmet took action. She sent a text directly to Stephen Bowen asking if he knew where his wife was. His reply came back quickly. He said he had texted Nancy and she was not picking up. He added that her car was not at the house, framing her absence as something he could not account for, something that had nothing to do with him. What investigators would later establish is that when Bowen sent that message, Nancy was already gone. He was not a confused husband trying to locate his wife. He knew exactly where she was. That text exchange, written in a cooperative tone, offering a plausible explanation, was sent by a man who had been inside that house all night and had left before the city started asking questions. Separately, a close friend of Nancy's had also been trying to reach her that morning. After speaking with Bowen directly by phone, that friend called police. The reason was precise. Bowen had sounded suspicious during that conversation. That call, combined with the mounting concern from city staff who could not account for Nancy's whereabouts, moved the situation from a welfare concern to an active police response. Nancy's family members, having heard that she could not be reached and that something felt wrong, went directly to the house. The 911 call recorded during that period, released publicly by law enforcement on April 3, 2026, captured a voice of a family member demanding that officers gain entry to the property immediately by whatever means were necessary. That call was not the measured request of someone expecting a routine check. It was the voice of people who already understood, on some level, that what was waiting on the other side of that door was not going to be what anyone wanted to find. Officers from the Coral Springs Police Department arrived at the home on the 800 block of Northwest 127th Avenue at 10:04 that morning. Before they even entered the building, their initial assessment of the property's exterior identified structural damage that was consistent with a firearm discharge. That finding was an early and significant evidentiary marker, one that confirmed this was not a situation that would resolve itself with a simple explanation. No spare key to the property was available. A SWAT team was deployed and forced entry into the home. Inside the second-floor master bedroom, officers located Vice Mayor Nancy Metayer Bowen. She had been concealed. Investigators documented that her body had been covered and placed on the bed in a manner that made clear deliberate steps had been taken after the fact. Physical evidence recovered at the scene, including forensic material consistent with a firearm discharge, was documented and secured. A preliminary on-scene examination identified a wound to her shoulder. The residence was immediately locked down, and the investigation was formally classified as a homicide. Stephen Bowen was not at the property. He had been gone since the early hours of that morning. What investigators had working in their favor from the very beginning of the pursuit was technology that has fundamentally changed the pace of modern law enforcement. License plate reader systems, automated cameras installed across road networks throughout Broward County that photograph passing vehicles, record license plate numbers, and timestamp and log each reading into a centralized, searchable database, allowed investigators to reconstruct Bowen's route without relying on a single eyewitness account. Within a compressed window of time, LPR data had placed his Ford F-150 pickup truck moving south from Coral Springs through Fort Lauderdale and into the city of Plantation, approximately 13 miles from the couple's home. Before the pursuit was even fully underway, investigators had another piece of the timeline that would prove critical. An unnamed neighbor in the area had observed Nancy outside, walking her dog, at approximately midnight on the night of March 31st. That account represents the last independently documented sighting of Nancy Metayer Bowen alive. It places her outside, following her normal routine at midnight. Everything that happened to her occurred after that moment, inside a home where, according to the record, only one other person was present. At approximately 10 a.m. on April 1st, while officers were still on scene at Northwest 127th Avenue, Stephen Bowen arrived at the home of his uncle, Owen Small, in Plantation. What he said to Small when he arrived was direct and specific. He told his uncle that he had done something to Nancy. He told him that she was not alive. Small did not place a call to emergency services at that moment. That call did not come until 1:51 that afternoon. When it did, it gave investigators the legal and factual confirmation they needed to move forward with the next phase of the operation. while Bowen remained in Plantation and while law enforcement was actively monitoring his movements. Investigators observe him make direct physical contact with a man named Leslie Washington Jr. Bowen handed Washington a bag that investigators described as consistent in shape and size with a case designed to carry a firearm. Washington also accepted ammunition from Bowen during that same interaction. That exchange, observed in real time by investigators who were already watching, became the documented factual foundation for the evidence tampering charge that would be filed alongside the murder charge. Bowen was not simply putting distance between himself and the home. He was actively working to separate himself from the physical evidence tied to what had taken place the previous night. At 2:35 p.m. on April 1st, 2026, units from the Broward Sheriff's Office located Stephen Bowen at the Landmark Towers apartment complex in Plantation. The Fort Lauderdale Police Department and the Plantation Police Department were both active participants in the coordinated response. As officers moved in to take him into custody, Bowen made a statement that confirmed he understood exactly what was happening and exactly why law enforcement had arrived. He was taken into custody without physical resistance. He immediately invoked his right to legal counsel and declined to answer any further questions from investigators. At the press conference that followed, Coral Springs Police Chief Brad Mock stood before reporters and specifically named and thanked the Broward Sheriff's Office, the Fort Lauderdale Police Department, and the Plantation Police Department for their contributions to the operation. From the moment Nancy's colleagues first noticed her absence at that 9 a.m. meeting to the moment Stephen Bowen was in custody in Plantation, less than 5 hours had passed. 3 agencies, multiple jurisdictions, one coordinated, methodical response. And it worked. Stephen Bowen was in custody. The investigation had moved faster than most cases of this nature ever do. But what happened in the days that followed his arrest introduced a legal dimension to this case that most coverage has not fully addressed. And it begins in a Broward County courtroom on the morning of April 2nd, 2026. Less than 24 hours after his arrest, Stephen Bowen stood before Judge Corey B. Friedman in Broward County Bond Court for his first formal appearance. The charges presented against him were serious, specific, and filed simultaneously. First-degree premeditated murder and tampering with or fabricating physical evidence. 2 distinct charges. 2 distinct legal standards. Both brought forward together. Judge Friedman did not arrive at that hearing without a detailed factual foundation. Before him was the probable cause affidavit prepared and submitted by the Coral Springs Police Department. That document laid out the legal basis for both charges in precise terms. It referenced Bowen's verbal admission to his uncle Owen Small on the morning of April 1st, the direct statement that Nancy was not alive and that he had done something to her. It documented the physical evidence recovered at the property, noting findings both on the exterior structure of the home and inside the residence that were consistent with the events investigators were piecing together. It included the surveillance documentation of Bowen's exchange with Leslie Washington Jr. in Plantation, the transfer of a carrying case and related items that formed the core of the tampering charge. And it outlined the license plate reader data that had tracked Bowen's vehicle moving south through Broward County in the hours following the incident. Judge Friedman reviewed the affidavit in full and found probable cause on both counts without hesitation. The ruling on bond was direct. Bond was denied. Stephen Bowen was ordered held without bond at Broward County Main Jail. He would not be returning home. At that same first appearance, Bowen formally declared himself indigent, a legal designation meaning he stated to the court that he lacked the financial resources to retain private legal counsel. That declaration carries constitutional weight. Under the United States Constitution, every person facing serious criminal charges has the right to legal representation regardless of their financial situation. When a defendant cannot afford an attorney, the state carries the obligation to provide one. The Broward County Public Defender's Office was assigned to take on his representation. At that point, the case appeared to be moving forward on a standard track. For days later, that changed. On April 6th, 2026, the Broward County Public Defender's Office filed a formal motion asking the presiding judge to remove them from Stephen Bowen's case entirely. The reason they put forward was not procedural or administrative. It was relational. Multiple attorneys working within the Broward County Public Defender's Office had personal and professional connections to Nancy Metayer Bowen during her lifetime. She had been a commissioner and vice mayor in that community for 6 years. Her professional network extended across Broward County at every level: civic organizations, political offices, legal institutions, and community programs. The attorneys who would have been responsible for defending the man charged in connection with her death had known her. Some had worked alongside her professionally. Some had relationships with her that went beyond the professional entirely. The public defender's office argued in their filing that this situation created a conflict of interest that could not be managed internally. Their language was unambiguous. They stated they were ethically barred from continuing Bowen's representation, that proceeding under these circumstances would compromise his constitutional right to effective legal counsel, his right to due process, and his right to a fair trial. They were not withdrawing because of the weight of the charges. They were withdrawing because of who the victim was and how deeply her presence had reached into the professional lives of the people now being asked to defend the man accused in her death. The legal problem this created was layered and immediate. Bowen had been declared indigent. He had no means to retain private counsel on his own. The office constitutionally obligated to represent him had just told a judge it could not do so in good conscience. The court was now responsible for identifying and assigning what the legal system refers to as a conflict attorney, a private attorney who is appointed by the court and compensated by the state in specific cases where the public defender faces an ethical barrier to service. That process takes time. It requires court approval, identification of a qualified attorney willing and able to take the assignment, and formal documentation of the arrangement. In a first-degree murder case of this profile, that process carries additional weight. What this development communicates beyond its legal mechanics is something worth sitting with. Nancy Metayer Bowen's presence in Broward County was not surface level. It was not the kind of professional footprint that fades when someone is no longer in a room. It was deep enough, personal enough, and wide enough that it reached into the office legally required to defend the man accused of ending her life. That is the measure of a person whose years of work in that community had built something that outlasted her. Leslie Washington Jr. remains a significant figure in what comes next for this case. His role in the afternoon of April 1st, the exchange observed directly by investigators in Plantation, is the factual basis of the tampering charge. But his significance extends beyond that single moment. He was identified through active surveillance. He was present in the area at the time of Bowen's arrest. The details of what he received and agreed to hold connect him directly to the physical evidence at the center of this case. What he tells investigators, and what role his account plays if this proceeds to trial, is one of several independent threads the prosecution has to work with. Because that is what distinguishes this evidentiary record from cases that rest on a single account or a single piece of evidence. What exists here is layered. Bowen's verbal admission to Owen Small, the physical evidence documented at the home, the license plate reader data mapping his route through Broward County, the surveillance of the exchange in Plantation. Each piece of evidence was gathered independently. Each one stands on its own. Together, they form a case that prosecutors will present before a jury when this matter reaches trial. As of the recording of this documentary, Stephen Bowen's legal representation remains publicly unresolved. No trial date has been scheduled. The case is in pretrial proceedings. The full picture of what a court will hear and what a jury will ultimately be asked to decide is still ahead. When news of Nancy Metayer Bowen's death reached the public on April 1st, 2026, the response was not measured or delayed. It was immediate, wide, and came from every level of public and civic life that Nancy had touched across her career. And the people who responded were not reaching for polished statements crafted for public consumption. They were saying what they actually felt. And the difference between those two things showed in every word. U.S. Representative Jerry Moskowitz was among the first to speak. He had been with Nancy just 4 days earlier, the Saturday before her death, in person, in the same room, talking about the future. When the news broke on April 1st, he posted publicly without diplomatic softening. He wrote that he was in shock, that he had just been with her, that she had just buried her brother, that she had been days away from announcing her congressional run. He called her one of the nicest people he had worked with in public life, someone who was always fighting for her community, always focused on the people she represented. For Moskowitz, this was not a statement about a professional contact. It was a statement about someone he had seen 4 days ago and had every expectation of seeing again. Florida Democratic Party Chair Nikki Fried had also seen Nancy recently. Just days before April 1st, the two had been together at the Florida Democratic Party's leadership summit. In her public statement, Fried did not lead with Nancy's title. She led with what Nancy actually was: a scientist, an environmentalist, a barrier breaker who had made history in Coral Springs and had kept making it at every level above it. Fried said the Florida Democratic Party was mourning the loss of someone she described as their beloved vice chair, a woman who had not simply held a position, but had used it to do something real, consistently, for the people she served. U.S. Representative Byron Donalds responded on X in terms that were brief, direct, and unambiguous. He wrote that he was heartbroken to learn of the loss of Vice Mayor Nancy Metayer Bowen. He called for justice to be swift. No additional framing was necessary. The statement said what it needed to say. State Representative Angie Nixon chose 3 words to describe her relationship with Nancy: friend, colleague, and sister in the movement. Those 3 words communicated the depth and the nature of what had been lost between them more precisely than a longer statement would have. Broward County Mayor Mark Bogan released a formal statement noting that Nancy had served her community with dedication and heart, and that the impact of her years in public service would continue to be felt across Broward County. A statement like that, coming from the county's highest elected office, reflects how far Nancy's reach had extended beyond the city limits of Coral Springs. Inside Coral Springs city government, the response carried a different texture entirely, because these were the people who had worked alongside Nancy in the day-to-day reality of governing a city. These were the people who had sat in the same meetings, made the same decisions, and shared the same offices. Their grief was not abstract. City Manager Catherine Givens stood before reporters and spoke without reaching for institutional language. She said that to call April 1st a very dark day for Coral Springs was an understatement, that their hearts were truly broken. Those are not the words of someone reading from a prepared release. Those are the words of someone trying to hold it together in public while processing something they had not been prepared for. Coral Springs Mayor Scott Brook attended the community vigil on April 4th and spoke to the specific qualities that had defined Nancy's time in public service: her commitment to youth, her consistency, her focus on the people the city existed to serve. He described the community's effort to honor her as their best attempt to recognize someone who had given Coral Springs everything she had. Commissioner Joshua Simmons, who had known Nancy both personally and professionally through years of shared public service, offered the most direct statement of any city colleague. He said his soul was heavy and his heart was broken. Not a word wasted. Not a phrase constructed for appearance. Just the honest weight of what he was carrying. Tamarack Vice Mayor Marlon Bolton noted something that many people felt, but few said plainly. Nancy's career had only just been getting started. The trajectory she was on, the seat she was about to seek, the work she still had ahead of her, all of it was cut short at the moment it was reaching its highest point. Among the voices that carried particular significance was Jepsy Metellus, Executive Director of Sant Law, the leadership development program that had identified Nancy as a fellow years before she held any elected title. Metellus did not offer condolences in the conventional sense. She said that he had really robbed them, that Nancy had been doing the work, that she had been moving forward, that none of them had ever imagined she had been carrying something so heavy in private while showing up so fully in public. Coming from the person who had seen Nancy's potential before most of the political world had, that statement was not general. It was specific, earned, and pointed directly at the gap between who Nancy appeared to be and what may have been happening behind closed doors. Sandra Dennis of the Miami Workers Center described Nancy as someone who truly believed in people, a leader whose integrity was not a performance, whose word carried weight, and whose presence made the people around her feel that they were being led by someone honest and purposeful. Dennis noted that people trusted Nancy's leadership, and that kind of trust, once built, does not transfer easily to someone else. Crystal Lador, Nancy's mentee, brought flowers to Coral Springs City Hall on the day of the vigil. She told reporters that no matter what the topic of conversation had been, it always circled back to the same question with Nancy. What are we going to do to help the people? Not a talking point, not a campaign phrase. A genuine, recurring instinct that showed up every time. On April 4th, 2026, the community organized a candlelight vigil on the steps of Coral Springs City Hall. This was not a city-sponsored event. The people of Coral Springs organized it themselves. They asked attendees to bring white candles and to wear orange in Nancy's honor. Elected officials stood alongside residents on those steps. The city flag flew at half-staff. The city created a dedicated webpage to keep the public informed as the legal case moved forward. Nancy Metayer Bowen was laid to rest at church by the Glades in Coral Springs. The procession to the church was escorted by Coral Springs police. Staff members made the trip from Tallahassee to attend. Dozens were already waiting outside the church before the service began. A flag was displayed at the entrance in her honor. One colleague, speaking about the last time he had seen Nancy before April 1st, remembered that she had turned away from a handshake and asked for a hug instead. He said she was his friend, and that if he was being completely honest, he was still trying to make sense of how they had arrived at that moment. Standing at church saying goodbye to a woman who, the last time he saw her, had pulled him close and made him feel like everything was still as it should be. Her family released a statement that said what those who had watched Nancy from the outside could only partially understand. They said that while many had known her as a leader and an advocate, they had known her as a sister, a daughter, and a friend, someone whose warmth and laughter had filled every room she entered. Not a public figure first, a person first. That distinction, in the end, is what made the loss so hard to put into words, and why so many people across Florida tried anyway. You have just watched a community process a loss that none of them saw coming. A vice mayor, a barrier breaker, a woman who had spent years building something real, and who was by every documented measure standing at the most significant point of her career when April 1st, 2026 arrived. The grief was real, the tributes were real, and the legal process that will determine the full truth of what happened on the night of March 31st, 2026, and what motivated it, has not yet run its course. No trial date has been set. Stephen Bowen remains in Broward County Main Jail without bond. The questions that the public record has not yet answered will only be addressed when this case reaches a courtroom and the evidence is placed in front of a jury. Fatal vows will be present for every step of that process. Every motion filed, every hearing that moves this case forward, every development that brings it closer to a verdict, covered with the same factual depth and investigative detail you have watched throughout this documentary. If you're not subscribed to Fatal Vows yet, this is the moment. Hit subscribe right now and turn on notifications. Because when this case goes to trial, the testimony, the evidence, and the arguments made in open court will answer questions that have not been publicly addressed yet. You do not want to arrive at that moment without context. Subscribe. Turn on notifications. This story has more chapters ahead, and Fatal Vows will be there for all of them. There is a pattern in cases like this one that does not get enough attention. Not because the information is hard to find, but because it asks people to reconsider assumptions they have held for a long time. Assumptions about who is at risk, what warning signs look like, and why some of the most serious situations are also the least visible ones. Nancy Metayer Bowen held a Master of Health Science from Johns Hopkins-University. She served as an elected official in a city that had chosen her twice. Her name was being discussed at the congressional level. Her professional network reached into virtually every significant civic institution in Broward County. By every external measure available to the people around her, her life looked purposeful, forward-moving, and secure. There were no prior emergency calls logged from the couple's address. No restraining orders existed in the court record. No colleagues, neighbors, or community members had filed any reports expressing concern about her safety at home. The Coral Springs Police Department had no prior history with that property at all. Nothing in the available public record before April 1st, 2026, pointed toward what investigators found when they entered that home. That complete absence of visible indicators is not a coincidence. It is, in fact, one of the most consistently documented features of a specific pattern that researchers and clinicians who specialize in relationship violence have studied and written about for decades. The term that appears in academic and clinical literature for this pattern is the high-functioning victim. It refers to an individual whose professional achievement, social confidence, and public visibility create an external picture that does not reflect what is happening behind closed doors. The more accomplished and publicly present someone is, the less likely the people around them are to consider that their private life may carry difficulty or danger. That gap between what is seen publicly and what is real privately is not incidental to these situations. In many documented cases, it is part of what allows them to continue without anyone noticing until it is too late. The research on this is not ambiguous. Studies conducted by relationship violence organizations, law enforcement agencies, and academic institutions consistently show that this type of relationship harm does not select based on education level, professional title, income, or public profile. It occurs at every level of society, in every demographic, and in every type of relationship. What varies is not who it happens to. What varies is how visible it is, and how long it takes for the people closest to the situation to recognize that something is wrong. Several facts specific to this case correspond directly with risk factors that trained clinicians and law enforcement professionals identify in their own published assessment tools. Stephen Bowen had documented publicly visible access to firearms. He described himself in his own social media biography using the word armed. His accounts contain multiple posts from shooting range sessions. Within established research on relationship safety, access to firearms in a household where unresolved conflict is present is one of the most consistently cited factors associated with elevated risk. It does not generate conflict on its own, but it changes what that conflict is capable of becoming. The couple was also navigating documented financial pressure at the time of the incident. Court records confirmed that their homeowners association had filed a civil foreclosure action against them in November 2025, citing a specific unpaid balance of $3,710.25. That action was dismissed in January 2026. The dismissal removed the immediate legal threat. It did not remove the underlying financial reality that had made the filing necessary in the first place. That pressure remained inside the household. Layered on top of that financial strain was fresh and significant personal loss. Donovan Joshua Lee Metayer had passed away on December 15, 2025, 107 days before Nancy was found dead. Clinical literature on relationship safety consistently identifies the combination of grief and financial stress occurring at the same time as a period of compounded pressure that warrants particular attention. Not because loss or financial difficulty cause harm. They do not. But because they add weight to situations that may already be carrying more than what is visible from the outside. It is important to be clear about what this information is and what it is not. Nothing documented in this chapter transfers responsibility away from the individual who makes a choice to cause harm. That responsibility is fixed. It belongs solely to the person who acts, and it does not shift regardless of the circumstances that surrounded them. What this chapter provides is a factual framework, grounded in published research and applied to verified details from this specific case. For understanding how a situation this serious can exist inside a life that appeared, to virtually everyone watching, to have no cause for concern. Recognizing that framework is not about assigning blame in a different direction. It is about giving people the ability to see these situations with clearer eyes before they reach a point that cannot be undone. If you or someone you know is in a situation that does not feel safe, the National Domestic Violence Hotline operates around the clock, every single day of the year. The number is 1-800-799-7233. The service is free. It is completely confidential. It is staffed by trained advocates who understand these situations, and it is available in more than 170 languages. You do not have to be certain that something is wrong to reach out. You only have to feel like something is not right. Nancy Metayer Bowen spent her career building access, opening doors, and making sure that resources reached the people who needed them most. The least this documentary can do is point toward one of those resources directly. What she built and what she left behind is where this documentary ends.